Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Chitheads. My guest today is Jonathan Edelmann. Jonathan is an assistant professor of religion at the University of Florida and an affiliated faculty member at the Center for the Study of Hindu Traditions. He received a BA in philosophy from the University of California, Santa Barbara, an MA in science and religion from Oxford, and a PhD from Oxford in religious studies and theology. While at Oxford, he was affiliated with Harris Manchester College and the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies. His fields of research are twofold. The first is the Bhāgavata Purāṇa, which we'll be talking about today, as well as the Sanskrit theological and philosophical tradition that surrounds it, known as Gaudiya or Chaitanya Vaishnavism. The second is the manner in which Hindu thought and Indian philosophy has interacted with and might further interact with Western thought in a constructive manner, especially the evolutionary sciences and Western philosophy. Edelmann has argued for a discussion between Hindu thought and the evolutionary sciences, one that respects the autonomy and value of multiple perspectives in the ongoing discovery of our world. Jonathan is currently working on ethics in the Gaudiya Vaiṣṇava tradition and the definitions of the three yogas, karma, jnana, and bhakti. Some long-term plans involve making the Bhagavad Gita's commentarial tradition more accessible to students and scholars, evaluating various Western reductive theories of mind and consciousness in conversation with Hindu conceptions of self, as well as translating the writings of Vishvanatha Chakravartin. So with that, hello, Jonathan. Thanks so much for joining me.
Hello. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to talk to you today. I've really enjoyed reading your recent book, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. But before we do, I would love to just hear a little bit about your own personal story and what has led you to the work that you do.
Practically speaking, I started to get interested in Indian thought and philosophy and literature and sort of the life of the mind. I guess around 17, 18 years old.
Okay.
I had to read Henry David Thoreau for my English literature class, Mr. Potts. He made us read Thoreau, which was, in retrospect, that was a very a great thing that he did for me. And at the first reading of Thoreau, we had to read Economy, which is his first chapter in Walden. It's dense. It's difficult writing. It's literature, but it grew on me. There was something about it that really resonated very deeply with me. I liked how he thought about language and how he expressed himself. But more as I got kind of 18, 19 years old, I got more interested in sort of the lifestyle that he took up. And also, he introduced me to books like the Bhagavad Gita.
Right.
And as I was turning about 18, I just graduated high school, starting to think about what I wanted to do with my life. I started reading books like the Bhagavad Gita, and that brought me into the Sanskrit language, and it brought me in touch with Hindu communities in the United States and in England, and eventually even in India. And then when I started my undergraduate degree in philosophy, I had sort of a lot of Thoreau sort of the back of my mind. And kind of sort of midway through my BA in philosophy, I actually became much more interested in the study of religion. I think that's really what I wanted. And I didn't quite know at that age what Western philosophy would look like.
Yeah. Did you think it would have some kind of spiritual component that you were sort of seeking?
I thought it might. And I think my interest gravitated more towards what I would call the philosophy of religion or theology and textual study. But really, what I think I should have known, but I didn't know at the time, is that Western philosophy would be Western philosophy.
Yeah.
And there was really nobody in the department, this was in Santa Barbara, that really knew hardly anything about Indian philosophy. And the few times that I did bring it up, it was not dismissed, but it was clearly seen as something not really worthy of too much time or effort. at the same time, religious studies was thriving. It still is thriving at UC Santa Barbara. And so I got to know some of the religious studies scholars, Barbara Holdridge, Alan Wallace, who's a great scholar of Buddhism, was there at the time, his wife, Vesna Wallace, and a few others. And so I was moving. By the time I was like a junior, I spent most of my time in religious studies and talking with people in religious studies. And that's the direction that I went for graduate work.
Well, there's definitely, knowing that you had this kind of background of philosophy, I feel like has really enriched your work. I mean, reading the book that we're going to talk about shortly, there's definitely a philosophical kind of component to it, which I think enriches what you're doing. How do you feel like philosophy contributes to your work today? Do you feel like you've found this kind of seamless connection between religion and philosophy for you, or do you still, butt up against these sort of, departmental or institutionalized ways of separating the two?
No, it's actually been really a good. I found a good spot. I can say it like that. Yeah. And I think the term theology, it came to encompass a lot of what I was thinking, the way I thought about things. And for me, theology is a serious approach to a textual tradition. In Hinduism, it pays a tremendous amount of attention to the language of Sanskrit texts, but I like the side of it that is very much a rational engagement with a historical tradition. And I've been able to find that in religious studies. Religious studies as it's construed in America, for the most part, has tried to separate itself from theology.
Yeah.
And for me, that's been the real but, and not necessarily a bad way, or it's been a potential source of conflict, but it's never really been a conflict. But it's something that I think about and I'm aware of. That religious studies in America is it's distinctly not theology,
right.
And it is.
And the motivation behind that separation is that the religious studies departments are trying to approach religion from a sort of so-called objective standpoint, whereas theology is more, a religiously immanent position from which someone is articulating the philosophy or the theology. Is that kind of are those the stakes?
There's a long history to it, and it's changed over time, and there's a slightly different story depending on who you talk to. But I think those broad categories are mostly correct. That religious studies is something that non-believers do.
Right.
You don't believe and or engage or practice the religion that you study. And there are other modalities. There's a wide range of modalities for study in religious studies that theology wouldn't have. Whereas theology, more or less, it presupposes some type of connection with the tradition, although I think it can be construed in a wide variety of different ways, and there's different ways to be connected with a religion. And theology is more monolithic in the way that it approaches texts and approaches the study of religion. It's more text-based and more historically grounded and more constructive and things like that.
Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit about your book, which is called Hindu Theology and Biology, the Bhāgavata, Purāṇa, and Contemporary Theory. And I have to say, when I first saw the title of this book, first of all, to me, the question of religion and science is a really fascinating one. And so I was so happy that you did this book. But at first, it seemed rather odd. I mean, one would not put biology and the Bhāgavata, Purāṇa in the same sentence necessarily. So,
right.
It's at once seemingly odd and then also quite radical in that you're, bringing this theological text, the Bhāgavata Purāṇa, into a discussion with biology. So first of all, what is the Bhāgavata Purāṇa for people out there who don't know this text? And then can you talk about what your inspiration was behind writing this book?
Sure. Thanks. So the Bhāgavata Purāṇa, I feel, is probably composed somewhere in the 10th, 11th century. It was put together at that time. I feel there's no evidence of it prior to that.
Right.
Put it that way. Empirical, historical, documental evidence. It's a massive book. I mean, that's one way of putting it. It's divided into 12 separate books. Each one has many chapters. There's many, many commentaries on it. Among the Purāṇas, it is by far the most commented upon by people in the Sanskrit language. It was early on also translated into other Indian languages. And it took on almost immediately a pretty important status. And since that time, it's grown such that people who were also commenting on sort of the other big names in Hindu philosophy and theology, such as the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, the Brahma Sutra, and so forth, also started to pay a lot of attention to this book, the Bhāgavata Purāṇa. And at this point, it's considered one of the many important things that you should think about and read. And it's mainly centered on the worship of Krishna, devotion to Krishna. It's got strong philosophical or Vedantic or theological components to it. It discusses a lot about rasa, this great term in Indian aesthetics. And the things that I focused on in my book, it also has a tremendous amount to say about the nature of embodied consciousness, the self, sort of ordinary awareness, its relationship with different parts of the material reality, the physical world, the mental world, a lot about its origin, what we would call Sankhya and yoga. And it's deeply interested in giving a characterization of how the world comes about, how biological life comes about, and sort of fitting its own theology into a larger, quote unquote, scientific and psychological context that would have been familiar to people and would have represented kind of the highest, or one of the highest sort of philosophical and cosmological understandings of its time. And that's really where the connection that I saw was. The features of biology that I focus on are more philosophy of mind, consciousness, evolutionary theory, sort of the origin of the body and ultimately the mind, and what we can say about who we are and what our place is on the basis of sort of empirical studies. That continues to be something that I think a lot about.
So, just to kind of because I'm not as familiar with this text as I am with, for example, the Bhagavad Gita, which is often presented as the other main Vaiṣṇava bhakti text.
Yeah.
So how does that text, for someone who's trying to kind of understand, is there a strong distinction in the character between these two texts? Like, what are the essential differences between these two from your perspective?
I think they're in many ways very similar.
Okay.
Some of the big differences are the size, the detail. The Bhagavad Gita is 18 shortish chapters, and this is many hundreds and hundreds of chapters. Bhagavata is many hundreds and hundreds of chapters. The extensive discussion on rasa, the extensive cosmological features, the extent to which the Bhagavata is also bringing in other literature. There's a mini Ramayana in the Bhāgavata Purāṇa. There's a whole discussion about sort of people that would be known in a Vedic context, like Vritra. So the detail and level of engagement with what we might call sort of mythology or narrative is much greater.
Yeah.
There is some of the similarities are a similar engagement between the Bhagavad Gita and in the Bhāgavata Purāṇa, an engagement with concepts such as dharma, the older Vedic sacrifices, and how bhakti fits in with that. And I think by the time the Bhāgavata Purāṇa gets composed, there's some differences there, and there's between the two texts, but there's a lot one could say about that. But overall, I do think that there are similarities, even though there are some big differences too.
Yeah, and so the Bhāgavata Purāṇa is a later text.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the Gita would be, I don't know. It's part of the Mahabharata, and it's considered part of the older part of the Mahabharata as much as 2,500 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So then what was, this is such a specific conversation, biology and the theology of the Bhāgavata Purāṇa. So what was your inspiration, besides just a scholarly interest? There does seem to be a kind of a polemical inspiration as well behind what you're doing here. So can you talk a little bit more about that specifically?
Sure. This book it's kind of, I wrote it in kind of a different life. A lot has changed with me since I finished it.
Okay.
And sort of the me that started it and finished it is a little bit different than the me that's now. But the beginnings of it really were Thoreau, who had this. He cared about nature. Yeah. He really was in nature, and this interest in what is nature. And near the end of his life, he was a scholar of nature. He really wanted to study the seasons and the plant and tree life growth and the movements of water in his region. So he was really interested in the minutiae. But then more practically speaking, it was a fellow named Alan Wallace, who was the husband of Vaiṣṇava Wallace, both of whom taught at UC Santa Barbara. And they'd both be very interesting people to have on here.
Okay.
But when I was maybe a sophomore, I had a roommate who was a little bit older than me, and he was taking a class with Alan Wallace. And he said, "Oh, you really got to go in and check this class out. He's really..." And I went in, I attended his lecture, and then as I became like a junior or senior, I took this class he taught called Science and Religion, and it was really very interesting to me. And he's a Buddhist, and he now runs sort of a Buddhist meditation center, but it's also a think tank, and he does a lot of writing and he brings in practitioners, and he's respected by Buddhist monks and by Buddhist scholars to a certain degree. But he was dealing with issues in philosophy of mind. He was looking at Buddhist philosophy, and I thought, yeah, that's what I want to do. I want to do that with Hindu texts and traditions. And then, so as I was applying to graduate school, I just saw, I think this was probably even before the internet was something I used a lot of. This was probably 1999, 2000. I might have gotten a flyer or a leaflet that Oxford University was now teaching a master's course dedicated to science and religion.
Wow.
And the person that was teaching it at the time, John Brooke, his specialty was late 19th century, early 20th century Darwinian philosophy and its relationship with theology.
Wow.
So I applied, and I got in, and in fact, he was visiting Santa Barbara as I was applying. He just happened to be there to give what turned out to be a very popular and distinguished lecture at UC Santa Barbara. So I had the opportunity to meet him. I got admitted to the program. I was super excited.
Yeah.
And when I got to Oxford, it was a very, very rich and vibrant environment, and there was a tremendous amount of work being done on science and religion. And I think it was expected that I would find a very specific niche to work in. And I think I could have only written the books, I wrote the dissertation that became the book there. I think I could have only done it there because of all the resources that it provided.
Yeah.
And that's why I kind of jump into what seems like a very specific thing about a very general topic, science and religion, Hinduism and science, and it ends up being this very detailed study of it.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Now, talking about science and religion, this amazing program that you did, one thing I actually really liked about your introduction is the way that you discuss the idea of science and religion as being these kind of essentialized categories that, are abstracted from the scientists and the religionists themselves. And then this becomes, this strange abstract idea of science in conflict with religion, and you sort of problematize that. So I'm wondering if you could kind of rehash that a little bit and talk about that, because I think that's a really important point that is often lost.
Yeah, so this was John Brooks' major contribution, and why he got this professorship at Oxford, was his book written in 1991, where he argues solely from the Western tradition. He himself had not worked at all in India or China or other contexts at that time, but he argued persuasively, meticulously, in a very detailed way, that the way that these terms, science and religion, are used over the course of Western intellectual history, they change.
Yeah.
And great scientists and great theologians, they have their own unique ways that they divided up these terms, that they related them, and that they thought about them. And he made a more general point that when we want to talk about the relationship of science and religion, we should ourselves try to get away from this idea that these are these distinct things, like they're rocks,
Yeah.
They're things you can point to. No, they're concepts, they're models that human beings create and use. And the way that they've created them and used them change over time. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why we were able to work together so well, because he had this very capacious model, and at the same time also very detailed. He was very textually oriented. And that became the approach that I took. Let's get away from thinking about big narratives about this is science, that's religion, and let's get into the details of the text. And let's also realize that the way that we're engaging with the text has very much to do with who we are as individuals. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's just a fact or a truism about how the whole discipline works of science and religion.
Yeah. So one of the things you sort of brought up in that conversation was how the concept of religion often gets when people are sort of invoking that term, it's often saturated with all of these connotations that are really the inheritance of our Western religious narratives, and those don't quite fit the kind of the worldview of what we might call Eastern religion, and that by kind of throwing out these concepts or not letting them sort of dictate, the rules of engagement, that it then opens up the possibility of this conversation that you then offer throughout the book.
Yes.
So one thing that I want to talk about before we get into the details of the book is that one thing that I really liked that I thought was interesting is that you talk about in the introduction a new kind of Hindu theology, which has three main objectives. And I won't get into the objectives, but what stood out to me is that you described this as being different from, for example, popular forms of media in Hinduism, the teachings of contemporary Hindu religious leaders, Indology, and discussions of Hinduism as it is currently performed in religious studies and Indian philosophy. And I thought, wow, I mean, that's sort of everybody.
Right. Yeah.
So can you talk, can you talk about why you felt it necessary to carve out a different way of doing Hindu theology?
Right. And since I've written that, things have changed. I can say that.
Okay.
The distinctions that I wanted to draw were the sort of big pools of people. Okay. If we wanted to think about the types of people that engage with Hinduism, there's different groups you can form. Indology has been America's oldest sort of approach.
Yeah.
The oldest academic society in the United States is the American Oriental Society. It goes way back. Yeah.
The oldest society, period?
The oldest continuing academic society.
Wow.
In the United States, the American Oriental Society. They still run a journal. It's a fantastic journal. They still have an annual conference. It's a fantastic conference, and it was born out of a sort of classics type of approach, where there's an interest in philology, historical linguistics, grammar, so on and so forth. And it's a wonderful discipline. It's rigorous. To master it is, it's an accomplishment. But it's not interested in thinking about how ancient texts apply to contemporary issues. That's not what they do. And when I do Indology, and I've written Indological articles, and I'm interested in it as a field, it's also not what I do when I do that. Religious studies, on the other hand, might draw from Indology, but it has this component that is less interested, for the most part, in thinking about the tradition philosophically from a practitioner's point of view, as we discussed. Western philosophy, there are things that are changing now, and things have changed since I wrote that book, both in my own life and just the world in general. Western philosophy mainly deals with sort of Aristotle and Plato onward. And then you have popular Hindu temple worship, and there's all kinds of classes going on in that context. There's yoga, and there's people connected with that. But the connection between sort of an Indological type of approach, where you have the same scrutiny and rigor that an Indologist would have as you apply it, applying it to texts, and also thinking about it philosophically, the way a Western philosopher would sort of think. Those two things have rarely gone together. Now there are major exceptions to that.
So I'm sorry, if Indology is not looking at texts, it's looking at what? Cultural artifacts? Like what is
Indology is the examination of texts.
Oh, Indology is. For some reason, I thought you were saying that Indology is not the close examination of texts.
It is. Indology,
okay.
Indology is, here's an ancient text. I master its language. I understand it in its historical context.
So it's a philological kind of?
Philological, yep.
Okay, it's a philological approach. Okay, great.
Mm-hmm. And religious studies will sometimes incorporate parts of that, but it's less text-based, and religious studies has become more focused on living cultures and more like anthropology and sociology. That's a strong trend.
Mm-hmm. So there's a way in which the religious studies can kind of turn their object of study into an artifact rather than engaging with the liveliness of its ideas?
That's one way of thinking about it, yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and religious studies, I might also add, for the most part, doesn't take a stand on the truth or falsity of the thing that it studies.
Right.
Whereas Western philosophy is all about truth.
Yeah.
Is Plato right in his theory of ideas? Is Kant right in his theory of mind and perception? Those are the questions that a philosopher would be concerned with. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you don't see that as much in Indology or in religious studies. Mm-hmm. So questions of truth or falsity as they apply to the Hindu tradition, in a truth or falsity in a philosophical sense, is not a discipline that I'm aware of. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There are people that have started to do this and have done this, but it's not a formed discipline.
Yeah. Now, I'm just sort of thinking as we're talking about this of the possible pushback from, what are maybe conservative political forces in India or elsewhere that are resistant to this idea of bringing into conversation at all, because there's this sense that this is sort of, I don't know, some kind of imperialist or colonialist project to allow the ideas, the integrity of the ideas of the Indian tradition be polluted by an engagement with Western thought or something like that. Maybe you can speak on that more eloquently than I can. But what are your thoughts on sort of that pushback, and how can we do this in a way that is sensitive to these kind of cultural appropriation arguments and the ones that are, worthy of being paid attention to?
I think the things that you mentioned about cultural appropriation and some of the Hindutva trends and issues of identity politics, we might even say, those are major obstacles today.
Yeah.
There's this concern that if you're Hindu, you're Hindutva, as sort of nationalistic, fundamentalistic sort of approach. There's also pushback among some Hindus and Indians that, it's simply not the right of Western white scholars to make a truth claim. You've already taken over our yoga and our music and our art and our dance, and now you're messing with our history, our intellectual history, and you simply don't have the right to make evaluations of what our people thought. It's, if you want to talk about what Shankara said, please do it well, but was Shankara right or wrong? Was he good or bad as a philosopher, as a theologian? That's not your position to say those types of things. I think that those are challenges that we face today, and there were other challenges in the past. Yeah, I think it's something very distinct about Hinduism. It's not as big an issue in the study of Buddhism, for example.
Yeah, well, and it's also interesting because it seems like there was within, the history of the intersection of Hinduism and the West, there was definitely a kind of evangelist sort of like, export the tradition, and with Vivekananda and people like that. So it seems interesting, and obviously we're in a different political climate, of course.
If I might just say something about Vivekananda, though, he was really the first Hindu to do that.
Yeah, okay.
To cross the ocean and to come and speak in a new language to a new group of people, to make a really concerted effort to do that. Mm-hmm. He was one of the first people, whereas Buddhism had already very actively exported itself for a very long time.
I see.
It had already, there were Buddhists crossing over the Himalayas, going into China and Japan and Thailand. And so it had already uncoupled itself
from any sort of geographical location.
Indian. Whereas Hinduism had for a very long time been primarily something that Indians did. And it had moved, it had certainly spread, but not to the same degree and not in the same ways that Buddhism had spread. And I think there's a sense in which the uncoupling of Indianness and Hindu-ness is something that is really just kind of starting fairly recently. And if you take Vivekananda 93 in Chicago, his first talk there, I think it was 1893 or 1896. If you take that as sort of the beginning point, and we're just over 100 years past that, from a historical point of view, it's really not too long.
Yeah.
That's my latest thought on this issue.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I don't think anybody that I've talked to about this issue has ever sort of brought up, and it makes total sense to think that there's historical precedent for Buddhism, but within the Hindu tradition, you're right, it's fairly recent. So it's sort of like, it's in that sense, it's understandable that there would be some kind of backlash, as there is anytime there's kind of a new transmission of ideas across cultures, I suppose.
Right.
So let's talk a little bit about the book, because we still haven't kind of talked about anything specific in terms of the the philosophical arguments, which I think are really interesting. So I'm going to do the best I can here. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to get through the entire book, although I'm planning on going back and reading the rest because I did find it very interesting. But one thing that you mentioned, and maybe we can just use this as kind of a doorway into a wider conversation, is that you mentioned that, the reason that, for example, Darwin and Dawkins, Richard Dawkins, this new
Right.
atheist, can say evolution reveals a universe without design is because their notion of the God doing that design hinges on this idea of God as the watchmaker, which you bring up, which is ultimately a kind of Judeo-Christian idea of God. And so you say in this section that there are other ideas of God and nature that
Yeah.
perhaps wouldn't fall into the same trap. And I remember even reading it, I was like thinking about how I was listening to some, scientists talk about, design isn't there because we've got these meaningless traits that are just continuing on, and why would a designer design that if it's not necessary to the organism, blah, 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 blah. So there's sort of this mind, not conscious development or evolutionary trajectory. So, what are the ideas of God and nature that you unpack in the book that are sort of answering these arguments?
Yeah, I'm afraid maybe I promised a bit more than I was able to deliver in that particular book, and I continue to think about the Bhāgavata and the Gaudiya concept of God. But what I wanted to do in that book, and what I was hoping to accomplish with that statement, is to enter sort of a new way of framing the discussion. And I'm partly responding to Bhaktivedanta Swami, who I mentioned, and somebody a tradition I engaged with. I never met him. He passed away in 1977. But the tradition he started, I was engaging with. The thing that I saw happening there, and I've seen happen quite a bit with discussions between Hinduism and Western traditions, is a sort of a very quick appropriation of other people's problems and other people's issues. And that's what I wanted to separate. Like, here is how Darwin talked about and thought about God, and how Dawkins has read and interpreted him, and here's how people have responded to both of them. Those are important things to know, but there's a sense in which Hinduism, it's a different discussion. And there are going to be some overlaps there. But we have to establish those overlaps in very different sorts of ways. And I think what I tried to argue in the book, what I did argue in this book, is that this issue between the world being designed or not designed that's not the issue. Mm-hmm. When we're talking about God and its relationship with nature. And the issue in the Bhāgavata is this sort of yogic engagement with nature. It's thinking about the natural world in a sophisticated, almost analytic, sort of ontological, philosophical way that it becomes an object of contemplation and consideration. And that's what I found in the text, that when it talks about these different sciences, it's talking about them in a larger yogic context and yogic language. One in which design's just not the issue.
Mm-hmm. But what then is, but for those that are, captivated by this idea of design, then what is I understand you're saying it's not the issue, but how is it situated then within a kind of theological understanding that's inspired by the Bhāgavata Purāṇa?
I think there's just different concepts. You have to bring in a different cosmology.
Okay. So let's bring it in.
Yeah. So first of all, karma is, you can't deny karma theory pervading everything. And the reason we are the way that we are is because of our karma.
Yeah.
And suffering. The fact that the world is a place of suffering. They're almost, karma and samsara they're twin concepts. They go together. And suffering, dukkha, the nature that all of the world is a place of suffering, is practically speaking built into the concept of samsara. And that's some of the things I allude to and I start to develop at the end of the book, and I want to develop further. Namely that the issue of design has a lot to do in the Western context with a failure of design.
Yeah.
Right. A lot of the biological structures that we have they've just been passed on, not because all of them were the very best thing at the very best context, just because they were passed on and they were selected. They were grouped up with other things and they were selected for a particular environment. But then we might move into a new environment, and so the things that we have from our evolutionary history may not be necessarily properly and well suited to the position that we're in geographically right now, for example. Well, you might think about that in terms of karma. That the body that we have is not designed, so to speak. There's no intention behind it being perfect and properly and well suited to the world. Of course it's going to be full of flaws, and full of problems. That's, the world is necessarily like that. And that the world is not perfect and ideal would be something that I think someone would expect from just a broad Indian karma theory context. That's point one. The other point that I want to develop is that the Bhāgavata's view is that God, sort of Ishvara or the Lord or Bhagavan or Krishna, is not actually, in fact, directly involved with the details of the world. It's passed over to a sort of a regular soul, a fellow named Brahma, and he's sort of in charge of making the world. And he himself has got limited capacities. He's not that all-knowing God. So I'm not saying that there really is a Brahma or not. That's not my view. I don't know. I have no idea. But my point is that from this Hindu point of view, yeah, it's not God that's making the world. In terms of the details of the structures of things, God is only, on this Hindu view, sort of the underlying ground of being that makes there a world at all, and sort of creates the power and energy that allows for this sort of ever-changing world to even be there. How and what is done with that is up to the people that are in that world. It's governed by karma. And therefore, since the people that are in it are themselves imperfect, sort of messy creatures, the world that they create themselves in some ways, that create themselves in one level, is also, it's not well planned. It's not well designed. It doesn't seem to be well thought out. It doesn't have this telos that many pre-Darwinian thinkers thought it should have, this sort of clear plan from, here's our starting point and here's our goal, 10,000 or a million years or a billion years later, let's get there in a nice, clean, easy way. No, the world, I think from a Hindu point of view, wouldn't exhibit those features. There's something inherently chaotic about it and sort of messy.
So in chapter 3, you go into a fairly elaborate epistemological discussion, and you explored, what constitutes knowledge in the Hindu and Western, Hindu tradition and the Western scientific tradition. But what I found really interesting was when you mentioned that the Bhāgavata begins by inviting the reader to drink the rasa of its words, rasa meaning an aesthetic experience of the divine. So can you talk about aesthetic experience as a means of knowledge and how, because this doesn't seem to be an epistemology that sort of has a lot of tread in Western science, this like aesthetic understanding of something as being a means of knowledge. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think this particular tradition's interest in science would have to have something to do with rasa.
Yeah.
and rasa being an aesthetic delight, and it's an aesthetic experience of a text. Rupa Goswami's book on the Bhāgavata Purāṇa, which is the Gaudiya Vaishnava's main author with regard to rasa, is the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. He says the devotee experiences rasa by hearing the text, by reading, engaging, thinking about, and studying the text. And so I began to think about, science as a form of literature, and science as something that people engage with and love as a form of literature. And I myself was at the time reading Darwin and really loving it and finding it to be, there's something enjoyable about reading really good science, and having we're having a really good conversation with the scientist who's informing you about the nature of the world in which we live. It's also a form of knowledge, in the sense it's something that we know. It's not this more of the sort of analytic knowledge that we generally associate with science, but it is knowledge in the sense that we know something about the world, and we're delighting and experience a sense of joy upon learning about the world. And that's kind of where my interest in science is at this point. It's
like a form of meditation almost.
Yeah, it's a form of meditation. It's something beautiful.
Yeah.
And of course, science is not always beautiful.
Yeah.
It also tells us very dark, terrible things about the world.
Yeah.
But that's also a form of rasa.
Right. Well, and also, I mean, with the dark, I'm thinking of the expression of Krishna, his what is the name of that presence of Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, where it's so overwhelming.
The Vishvarupa sometimes it's called, or the Virat.
Yeah,
where it's the favorite term in the Bhagavata.
Where it's like terrifying and overwhelming. Yeah. So with that kind of experience, that kind of rasa of science that does sort of resonate in a more, terrifying or dark way, would you kind of map that onto that sort of understanding of the divine?
Yeah, that's one way of doing it. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. That's it's one aspect of the world, and sort of God's presence in the world it's kind of terrible. Yeah. And it's just part of our world.
Yeah.
The animal kingdom's a terrible place. It's also very beautiful. It's also a very terrible place, and in the human world as well. We've created,
I know. I can't watch Planet Earth. I just can't watch all those little lizards getting eaten.
Right.
But I mean, I like this conversation. I had a recent, very different conversation with Vera de Schallenberg recently, where she was talking about the current political climate, for example, being a very dark one, but also that being a manifestation of the divine, and how do we cultivate a recognition of this as, she was thinking about it in terms of the mother and the dark, she used this term of the dark mother. And so I hear that here, and this continuing theme of being able to witness the divinity of things that are dark or unfortunate, or that we otherwise in our kind of more dualistic understanding of divinity would want to kind of purge from identification with the absolute, right? Because we want to keep the absolute as this sort of absolute goodness and light, and there's nothing dark about it. Whereas, what the work you're doing here seems to be offering this possibility of, something less discriminatory in that way.
That's, I think, there's a sense in which we know this in the West. I mean, horror is a genre of film, for example, or literature. And, even, political movies that are about the very terrible things, the ones that are done really well, they're also very beautiful.
Yeah. Shakespeare,
for example, a lot of what is going on it's terrible, but
people die at the end every time.
Right. People, but he's brought it to the stage he's brought it to the stage in a way that you there's a way in which you enjoy it.
Yeah. There's like a
Because
rapturous enjoyment. Yeah.
And that's, I think, what rasa theory is about, and the Bhāgavata itself is about trying to find the rasa in even the terrible things.
Yeah.
That's an aspect of it. And science has got to fit into that in some way, because it deals with disease and death and horror.
Yeah. But what about the argument from scientists that it's all that there's no, how do I articulate this question? That what science is sort of illustrating, or what science is showing, is that there is no meaning behind any of it. There is no God, because there is no there is no hand of design. We can see that, and so I don't know if you're.
I think I see where you're going.
You see where I'm going?
I do, and my reply to it is, the ultimate at this point in my life. And I would say it doesn't matter if there's a God or not, and what happens after death or not. If you're a scientist, you love science, and you probably love the things that the sciences study, namely the natural world, broadly speaking. Isn't that enough? That we take joy and the things that we produce, the literature and the theories that we produce, as we go about studying and thinking about the world. You don't necessarily have to believe in God or not believe in God to find the theory of evolution beautiful, majestic, encompassing. And you don't have to believe in God or not believe in God to think about the world through an evolutionary point of view and find that to be enriching to yourself.
Now, I understand that, but I mean, how, if it doesn't matter, then what's the inspiration behind cultivating a relationship of devotion or bhakti with Krishna or any other, murti? Why, how can I hold in the same space the idea that it all doesn't matter with the conviction that there's something to be gained by this relationship with God?
It's a very good question. I think it's a different question, though. I think it operates in a different space, and it deals with sort of a different reality, more directly. It hinges upon a different reality more directly. For me, bhakti is about, and this is where I maybe differ from some of my colleagues or some of my friends who are also into bhakti traditions. For me, the love that one should have for God and sort of the joy that one takes in being with God cannot and should not be something different than the rest of one's reality. And that means one's friends, family, society, culture, everything that's around one. So that's where I bring it. That's where I bring the two together. Is God something that really does exist after death, and you're going to go there? And is Krishna really a God that sort of I'll walk up to and shake his hand and give him a hug someday? That's a great idea. That's all I can say.
Yeah.
What a beautiful idea. Krishna, beautiful fellow, beautiful,
very blue
girlfriends and wives and loving parents, lives in this beautiful town, this sort of suburban sort of place in Vrindavan with rivers and trees, and it's just wonderful. And what a great idea of God. Does that God really exist? I'm not that. I'll wait and see. I think to me, that's really what theology is like, here's what could be.
Yeah, yeah.
And this is maybe where I differ from a lot of theologians as well. But for me, theology is just like, here's a possibility of what could be. And it should be a beautiful thing. And I think that's what Gaudiya Vaishnavism offers, is here's a really beautiful vision of God.
Mm-hmm.
But does that God really exist or not? It doesn't necessarily change my day-to-day life.
Mm-hmm.
It shouldn't necessarily change my day-to-day life. I think I still want to live as if that God might exist, mm-hmm. and try to bring as much sort of love and beauty into my life that I possibly can.
Mm-hmm. So I understand you're a scholar practitioner, correct? So would you consider yourself a bhakti practitioner?
Yes, but in a very different way than I think most of my colleagues would define bhakti.
Okay.
And in those ways. For me, bhakti is it's a form of love.
Yeah. And
the love and the way that I relate with, my family, that's also bhakti. My community, that's also bhakti. My scholarship and my writing, that's also bhakti.
Mm-hmm.
Do I actually go to temples and do what we would call sadhanas,
Yeah.
going to temples and chanting and doing things like that? No, hardly not at all. Hardly not at all.
So does the image or the murti of Krishna play a role at all in your sort of understanding of your practice as a bhakti?
It does, but to me it's a beautiful image.
Mm-hmm. So it's more.
And I
more
respect it, and I love it. I think it's a great idea.
Mm-hmm.
These are great things that human beings produced.
Right. It goes back to rasa.
Yeah.
It goes back to the aesthetic experience that is cultivated by
material things.
Mm-hmm.
Material things, images, texts, poems, philosophies, literatures.
Yeah.
Music. Yeah. Is there anything beyond that for me? Nobody knows. That's my real view.
Mm-hmm.
I know that's reductionistic, and it's making a broad universal claim that could be wrong, but that is my hunch.
Yeah. Well, and I think what's beautiful about it is that what you're implying is that there is a way to be engaged and enriched by spiritual practice without needing to answer that question, without needing to have a clear answer, is there or is there not a God? And I think that is a beautiful kind of radical.
And I think that the spiritual practice should itself be beautiful. It's something that you like.
Yeah.
That enriches your whole being, your physical body, your mind, your intellect, your understanding, everything. And that, to me, if it's not doing that, what's the point?
Yeah. 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 So this has been really great, and we're sort of nearing the end of our time together, but I wanted to ask you a question related to this article, another article you had shared with me called The Cause of Devotion in Gaudiya Vaisṇava Theology. And the reason I wanted to ask this is because for me, devotion or bhakti I've always been more captivated by the experience of wonder. When I have experiences of wonder, I don't know, the cosmos or anything in existence, I feel like that is sort of a doorway for me into this experience of divinity. So I'm curious what are the causes of devotion? Is wonder a precondition for devotion in the bhakti tradition? And then what is the role of this is of shraddha or conviction, as you say, in this movement towards bhakti?
Right. And so this is one of the more sort of Indological articles that I wrote. And it's the beginning of my attempt to really take a focused attention to the Gaudiya tradition as an idea. Um, and I've started to sort of think about what are their doctrines, what are sort of their main theological tenets, and this is one of them. That bhakti, they want to argue that bhakti is something you get from other people.
Right.
You encounter another bhakta and you think, oh, that sounds like a good idea.
Yeah.
And then shraddha is something that develops from that.
Oh. So you get the bhakti and then you develop the shraddha.
Yeah. You meet somebody, that person inspires you, gets you thinking in a different way. I'm putting what they, in a sort of informal way, what they put in a fairly technical way, but you meet somebody, they inspire you, and you think, yeah, I'll go back. You know, I'll meet that person again.
Yeah.
And then they start to tell you, well, if you're interested in this, this is what we do. It's what the tradition does. These are the practices that we engage in. These are the books we read. And you think, all right, sounds like a good idea. And that's what shraddha is. It's this, for me, it's generally translated as faith. And I think that works. Again, I'm concerned about sort of what faith means to us.
Right. Because it doesn't seem like the blind faith of Christianity. It
right.
seems
And
like
that's,
a different kind
my
of
main
faith.
concern is that when we think about faith in the West, and that may be just we're wrong about what faith is in the West. And I think
Right.
that's got a big chunk of it. But nevertheless, it happens. And that's why I avoid using the word faith. And I use a word like conviction, determination. You think it's something you hold close to your heart and you think this is a good idea.
Yeah.
And that's where they think bhakti, that's where they argue bhakti could come from. And sort of behind all that, they have this very big sort of metaphysical story that they're telling, that bhakti is something totally fundamentally, absolutely 100% different than other forms of love. Like when you have bhakti, it's not like other forms of love. You're like jumping into an entirely different stream than ordinary love, which is generally encompassed by this word kama.
Kama.
Yeah. And that might be where I end up really differing from them and thinking about things very in a different way. But the principle of the idea that religion and bhakti and these different spiritual traditions is something that you gain from other people, that makes a tremendous amount of sense to me. I wouldn't limit it to a face-to-face interaction, but maybe it comes through books or through music or recordings now of some type. But I do think that they're right about that you want to become a spiritual person through association, through camaraderie, through fellowship with other people that are like that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So now, lastly, because you brought it up earlier about being a different Jonathan Edelmann than you were when you wrote the book. So I'm just curious what things have changed in terms of, I don't know, your own conviction, your own priorities, in terms of what you're working on, or how you look at these traditions.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think when I wrote the book, I was alone, and I still am mostly alone in doing that type of work.
Okay.
I've since found that there are other people that have done it and are interested in doing it, but I found myself mainly around Christian, Jewish, Islamic, and occasional Buddhist groups, and there just simply were no people working in Hindu traditions doing this type of work. That I was always like the guy. I'd get invited to conferences, or I'd be on panels at conferences, and
You're the Hindu guy.
I'm the Hindu guy. That's right. There were the fellowships that I participated in, and I kind of just got tired of. It's like there's a room full of Abrahamics and an occasional Buddhist, and then there's me. They want to know something about Hinduism. They ask, Edelmann knows something. And so I said, I don't want to have a career based in that context. And so I said, so I had to and I'm glad I did. And now I work more with Sanskritists and people in religious studies and people doing Indian philosophy, and it's just a much bigger community of people.
Yeah.
So it's a very conscious shift that I took.
And before it was the science and religion people, is what you're saying.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
That's right. Right. And more theologically oriented people. And I guess I've also become, I guess, a bit more, the sort of view that I express about religion, a bit more agnostic and not in a bad. It's just I think I'm more humble now. Let me put it that way. To brag a little bit, I'm more humble about what I think I actually know.
Yeah.
About this life or the next. I'm much more sort of I know a lot about what's around me right now and in front of me, and larger questions of God's existence and the eternal nature of my being. I'm aware there are different systems of thought. Some of them seem more well composed than others. Some of them are more beautiful than others. But really, I think that's all that we have access to at this point is the richness of ideas.
Yeah.
About these larger questions.
So would you say that your alignment has moved away from theology? You sort of said you were hanging out with more theologically minded people, and now...
No, I still consider myself really to be doing some type of theology, even though I'm in a religious studies department. But I consider theology in the sense that I'm taking these historical ideas seriously enough to think that they deserve my attention, they deserve the attention of other people, and they deserve the attention in a way that suggests that they have actually something meaningful and true to say about the world. Yeah. It's opening that possibility. They're not just historical artifacts, but they can enrich our understanding of the world today. In that sense, I consider myself doing theology, a deep and abiding commitment to the truth of them. As I said, I'm hopeful about some of them. I'm not hopeful about others. I mean, right? There's a sense in which I would not want the Christian God to be the God.
Yeah, me neither.
The Islamic God, I don't. The Gaudiya Vaiṣṇava view of God, yeah, that sounds awesome.
Yeah, totally.
Even Kashmir Shiva, Abhinavagupta, that sounds great.
Yeah. Well, and then the question becomes, have the Christians actually got it right, or have they misinterpreted their own God, over the years?
That's right. Those are big,
So that's great. So what's next on the agenda for you then? Are you going to be publishing another manuscript anytime soon, or do you have?
Hopefully. Right now, I'm really doing a lot of work on the Gaudiyas. I'm reading a lot of their commentaries, and especially their larger intellectual context, especially someone named Sridhara Swami, indebtedness to sort of Advaita Vedanta. Then there's the whole Kavya and Rasa theory, that side of thing. People like Vopadev and Hemadri, who are even predecessors of Sridhara. I think those people need to be understood. But then just trying to get a sense of the details of their work and the larger corpus of literature that they wrote. And then this fellow Vishwanath, I really have, he wrote in Vrindavan and in that area of Mathura in the early 1700s. I love his work. I think he really put it all together in a way that his predecessors had not been able to. He was about 150 years after people like Jiva Goswami and Rupa Goswami. I believe he was like the first real Gaudiya Vaishnava theologian in the sense that he grew up in the tradition.
Yeah.
He wasn't making it up as Rupa and Jiva and Sanatana were as they went along. He inherited it, and he had some time and to critically reflect on it and So I really appreciate his work. But I think in order to read Vaiṣṇava properly, you do have to go back to Jiva and Rupa, and you have to go back to Sridhara and Rasa theory, and if you go back to Vopadev and Bhāgavata Purāṇa, and to read Shankara and Padmapad, a whole range of people to get into their world. That's kind of what I've been doing the past 5 years, and that's hopefully my next book will be about. So this literature.
Well, yeah, it sounds like that's a lot of material.
Yeah.
You got a lot of work to do.
Got a lot of work to do. Yeah, it's definitely keeping me busy.
Yeah, well, I'll look forward to seeing it when it comes out. So thank you so much, Jonathan. This has been a real pleasure.
And pleasure. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So is there any, if anyone wants to kind of read more of your work, or I don't know if you do workshops. I know you're at the University of Florida. People can look you up there. But is there any other contact information, websites, anything like that you'd like to share?
I have an academia.edu webpage that I try to update once in a while. My University of Florida webpage has some links to some things that I've written, and my book is available on Amazon and through Oxford University Press. Can get it there. But that's about it.
Well, that's quite enough.
I haven't at this point in my life developed too much of an online presence. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right. Well, it's been a real pleasure. Thanks so much, Jonathan. And
thank you.
Yes, I'll speak to you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.